In this video, I'm going to explain how to take apart a 1990 GSX750F engine, or the Suzuki Katana engine. 1989 to 1998 models, the engine should be the same. And in another video, I'm going to explain how to put it back together. In this video, I'm going to be taking apart everything, including the crankcase, where I split it in half, and just everything about how to take it apart. First thing you're probably going to want to do is get these three tools. These two over here, they help you install and take out the starter clutch, which is right behind this. And this other tool over here is for taking off and installing the actual clutch, which is on the other side of the engine, like right behind this thing over there. If you're confused about how to remove the gas tank, seat, and like carburetors and all that, I've made a separate video explaining how to replace the intake boots. And in that, I covered all of that. So go to that video if you're confused about how to take all of this off, because I'm going to take it all off camera. This is the service manual I'm using for my bike. It explains every detail of how to take it apart. It also goes over like specific torque for every single bolt and like the specifications for, like, let's say you're worried about your clutch or your transmission being too worn. What you're going to want to do is you're going to find it in this book, and then you're going to measure it with something like this to see if it still works. In my example, I'm taking apart my engine because I'm pretty sure the transmission is messed up. It's out of spec, so it's kind of in neutral, jumping into first every now and then, but it won't fully jump. It's just trying to. You'll probably be able to take apart your bike's engine and put it back together with the help of just my videos, but I really recommend you get one of these because there's just so much information in here, and I cannot possibly cover everything on my channel. This book is so helpful. I have noticed, however, that there's been a few small things that were wrong. For example, if you're working on the clutch and trying to get the push rod to engage properly, this book said to turn it to 1.25 or 1.5 turns out from the resistance. That's just not correct. So keep in mind that it does have mistakes in it. You're gonna find some mistakes. So I'll try to cover everything I can so you can do the best you can on your bike. When you're taking apart your engine, you're probably going to be stripping a few parts. It has to do with some parts being over tightened or rusting, and you're just going to end up stripping quite a few of them. For me, I ended up replacing most of the bolts that were prone to this on my engine, but my engine had also already been taken apart multiple times by the previous owner, and it looked essentially like he threw in all broken parts kind of a thing, and he over-torqued everything, and I just had so many problems with this particular engine. So hopefully your engine's not as bad as mine was, but just keep in mind that you're going to strip parts, so be as careful as you can every step of the way. Another thing is, don't forget to inspect every single part that you take off the engine. You want to measure parts that need to be measured and so on. And in my case, I ended up replacing so many parts where this is from one engine, this is from another, this is from another, this cover's from another, and then the shell is from another. Like, that's how many parts I've gotten into this engine. It's a real rebuild. Don't forget to keep in mind that having a clean area when you're working is a huge deal. Taking off your parts and putting them down in a way where you can remember how it goes back together just by the way it's organized, that's an incredibly helpful thing. Personally, I can take this bike apart and put parts just in bins, or hell, just one bin, and I can put it back together because I know where all the parts go. But you, on the other hand, you're probably going to want to put everything very clean and organized so you can figure out your way to put it back together. Some things also you want to put back in their original spots, like valves. Do not forget where each valve goes when you're taking them off. Keep them in the same spot. Last thing I have to say before we get started is I'm not going to be following the same steps that your owner's manual shows you. That's because you can take apart this bike in any variety of steps. An example, the alternator, you can take that off whenever you want. You can take apart the entire front and then move to the alternator, or you can just take it off right now. It doesn't really matter. But I'm going to be showing you how I take apart the bike. All right, time to get started. First, you're going to want to remove your battery, so disconnect your wires. Then you're going to want to move up front, and however you have your front wires set up, You might going to want to remove them because you're going to first remove this bar, and after you remove this bar, you're going to have to deal with these wires and then removing the top shell. Now you're going to want to drain the oil from your bike. Check if there's any metal shavings in there, and it generally helps if you warm the engine up before you drain the oil. So you could do that really at any step. Me, I just took a while to do it. Next, you're going to want to pull off all of these little things from on top of the bolts. I already did that for this one over here and some of them over here. Make sure you remove the oil pan before you continue. You don't want to drop anything in there. Now I drained the oil pan and put it right back. Now let's pull this thing off. Those were 12mm. Now we're going to move on to removing the starter. That is a 10mm nut. Now that we've disconnected that, let's remove all the spark plug boots up top just by pulling them out. I also have each one of these boots labeled. You can see the thing I put on here. On the other side it says number 1, as in it goes to number 1. Same thing for 2, 3, and 4. And you're going to want to also mark this one I put as an L on the left, and that one I actually have something right. Now let's pull the wires off of this. I labeled this one TEL as in top left. You'll notice my other wire is slightly different. That's because I have the coil relay mod. Just really helpful to get a better spark in your bike. So check it out if you want. It's on my channel as well, but let's move on. Now we're gonna actually pull off the coils themselves. They're all 10mm, and don't lose this small thing you have behind it. It's that little spacer right over there. Don't lose it. Now we're gonna move on to these oil lines. We're just gonna pull all of these out. Be delicate with them when you do. Now that you pull those off, don't lose those little O-rings behind there and possibly replace them. Now we're gonna move on to this over here, the tensioner. It's a 19mm, and I'm gonna take that off with this side. Now that we have this whole part out, make sure this is in a reasonable spec. You want it to be a specific length. Now we're gonna move on to over here. We're gonna be removing both of these. On a side note, when you're tightening this back in, the original, like the spring and everything, do not over tighten it. The book said something like 20 pounds per square inch, something like that, but you will break it before you hit that. You'll actually snap the entire housing. That's from personal experience. Keep note of the location of the tensioner when you pull it out. Personally, I like to leave it exactly where it is until I go to the assembly, and I'll go into further details of how to do that later on in the reassembly video I create. It's generally a lot easier to remove the oil line first before you remove the tensioner parts, but before you remove this oil line, you're going to want to remove both of these intake boots. I'm now going to remove the intake boots with this big tool and a large bit. You're going to want to pull off these clamps before you actually do that. Now let's pull off this hose right over here by pulling those two out. Now that we're going into the engine itself, we're going to have to loosen things up at a slower rate just because things are tightened down at a high pressure. And when you start loosening things up all the way, other bolts start taking all the pressure and you can break things that way. So do it in a very specific order that I show you. What I like to do is first loosen the center two over here and the center two over there. What you're going to want to do is this one first, that one, then the center one, but we're just barely loosening them because we want them to take the pressure that is going to go onto this instead. So now after that, we're going to loosen up these all the way and then finish loosening up these 10mm. And this one over here, you'll see we have another one on the exact opposite corner. You're going to want to treat this one the exact same way you treat these. You might have already noticed that it's hard to remove the bolts in the back with the oil pan in the way. What you're going to do now is just remove the 12mm up here. Just loosen them up all the way. Now that you pull those 12mm bolts off, all you got to do is bend it back a little bit and you got easy access back here. Don't lose any of the rubber washers that go here or the brass ones that go here. As you can see, I just pulled off the cover just now. All you got to do is pull it up and pull it out. It's particularly hard sometimes and you'll get it caught up on the frame, but you just got to maneuver it enough and then eventually you'll get it out. Now we're going to start removing the exhaust from the engine itself. We're going to start by loosening up these bolts, and since mine's an aftermarket exhaust, yours might not be the exact same entirely, but I'm going to explain to you how to remove mine real quick. For me, I only have one spot where the exhaust mounts to the bike, and that's just right here. For me, I'm pretty lucky. Now we're going to loosen up these bolts make sure we don't strip them. They're very easy to strip because of the location. If you struggle too much, you might have to remove this, but for me, I have the correct size ratchet extension, so I'm just fine. Also try to make sure that the entire weight of the exhaust is not on a single bolt. That way you're real easy gonna strip the threads that it's attached to, and you're gonna have to re-thread it, and that's just a whole mess. So what we're gonna do is loosen up each one of them, starting with the one on the right, and slowly go down, but we're not gonna loosen up the bolts all the way. We're just gonna loosen them up a decent amount. Now that we've loosened them all up a decent amount, we can start actually pulling them off one at a time. Before you do this, you might want to keep in mind how your exhaust is weighted essentially. If you have a lot of weight in the back, it's going to throw off the balance and it's going to try ripping it down a lot more. So in my case, I only have one exhaust. I don't have another one coming up the side over here, just on the other side. So my weight is not as bad as it could be for your case if you have like the original ones. So be very careful when just pulling these out. You don't want to strip anything. Now that you pulled them out, you want to rest them right on here. And then however your exhaust is set up, you're going to want to remove the part from the back and then slowly try to rest it down. And on a side note, whenever you're moving your exhaust, people like to wear gloves because fingerprints will rust and you'll have a fingerprint shaped rust spot on your bike. And for me, I don't really care because I'm going to be sanding it down and painting it later. And then I'm going to be throwing on titanium exhaust wrap. Now we're going to be removing the starter from the bike. Both of those two are 10mm. Now we're going to be removing this right over here. All it is a bunch of 10mm as usual. On a side note, you're probably going to want to put some paper towels or something in there so you don't drop anything. You're just really going to want to try to clog up all the ports that things can drop into. You'll also notice the lettering on here. Each one of them has a different shape letter, and it is because it goes in a very specific order. I'll go into that in reassembly as well, but when you're taking it apart, just try to put it together in the same order so you know what's going on. Now we're going to start removing all these 10mm. All you're going to want to do is make sure that all of them have this specific mark on them because you want to use this exact kind of bolt for it. And you're also going to want to start loosening them all slowly, and you don't want to remove one at a time. You want to start loosening them all individually and bring it out slowly just because of the pressure that's applied to them right now. Now that we've removed all of these, we can put them somewhere in a specific order so that we can remember how they go back together. In the reassembly video, I'll go into more detail about that. For now, you can leave the pins in if you want. It doesn't really matter. Just make sure you don't lose them. Now that you've removed everything over here, let's move up front. We're going to be removing these with 10mm the exact same way. Now I have the entire front removed. As you can see, there's nothing left. I also have it all over here. You can also notice it's labeled intake and exhaust on these two, so you can't really mix them up. And the letters, just keep them in order for now and watch my video how to reassemble later. You might have also noticed that I just dropped the chain in there. For me, it doesn't really matter. I like to use this magnet and just pull it out if I ever need to. But since I'm going all the way into the engine, it doesn't matter right now. So now we're going to pull this part right out of the front of the bike. Be delicate with it. You want this top piece up here to actually stay there. It can break very, very easily. And on a side note, make sure the bottom is actually straight. If it's bent, that means the last guy put it in wrong and broke it. Start removing the 8mm bolts that are under here and under here, right over there. Now we're going to be pulling out this 10mm bolt right here. Now we're going to start removing the cylinder head. This right here is a 14mm that we're going to be using, and we're going to be removing all of these nuts in a very specific order. We're going to look at this diagram right here, and we're going to remove it in descending order. So starting at 12, we're going to slightly loosen it, then move on to 11 and slightly loosen it, and so on. That's because each one of these nuts is under a large amount of torque, and if you decide to remove just one at a time, you're going to be leaving a ton of pressure on just a single nut, and then you're just going to strip it. So do this in specific order. Now that I've managed to loosen them all up, now we're just going to remove all of them and make sure you don't lose the washers, especially drop them inside of here. Now comes an annoying part. Now all you have to do is remove this from what's beneath it, the cylinders. And what you're going to have to do is wiggle it out, and the actual frame itself is going to get in the way, and it takes a very long time. And the washers that are stuck in there, make sure you don't lose them while you're pulling it out. I just managed to get my cylinder head off. Certainly took a minute, but I got it off. Now we're gonna be moving on to these oil pipes. You can just pull them straight out. It's pretty hard to sometimes because there's a lot of stuff that gets caught up in there. But I'm just gonna say it, replace the O-ring. Just do it. A lot of people have leaks from right there, and when you take it out, you're just gonna make it worse putting it back in. After that, we're gonna be removing this 10mm nut right here. Now we can just pull the cylinder straight out, the same way we pulled out the cylinder head. Now we're gonna remove the side of the engine. We're gonna start by pulling this off and pulling all of these off. Now we've got the cover off, we have all this exposed. All you gotta do is pull this pin out and then this gear comes out nice and easy. Before we continue with the starter clutch, let's move on to this first. First, we're gonna disconnect this right over here by pulling it off. Then we're gonna remove this with a 10mm. Don't lose the washer that's right behind this. Now that the washer and pin are removed, and so is the bolt completely, we can pull this off. Now we're gonna be removing this whole assembly by removing all of these little bolts on there. Now that we have this part removed, if you want, you can remove the spring from right here and then just pull this piece out. But make sure this thing doesn't fall out because it's really annoying to put back in, and the ball bearings inside of here, you just don't want to lose those. I'm deciding to pull mine out since I don't want it just to hang here. So next you're going to want to have a 12mm and a 10mm and just loosen it up all the way. Now let's pull off the kickstand relay right here. Now let's move on to this pin right here and just pull it straight out. Now we're going to go back to the starter clutch. As you can see, I've already got both of these tools installed. This is the specialty one, and this is just a 17mm. And behind it we have this one bolt. This is what we're going to be removing. It would have helped if I left the cylinders on, because when this thing rotates, it also rotates the pistons and gets them moving. And in my case, I'm going to have to make sure that these don't get caught on the crankcase itself and apply a lot of force to something that I don't want a lot of force being applied to. So in your case, just leave on the cylinders before doing this. And in my case, I'm just going to have to be careful when removing this. I just loosened mine up. And keep in mind, it's on really tight, but it is a normal thread, like righty-tighty, lefty-loosey kind of a deal. And I just loosened mine up, and I gotta say, I'm using a much larger one of these, and I'm resting it right on here. It feels like I'm cheating when I'm doing it. And I also put this on here. This used to be from one of the old forks I had, and all I did was put it on here for extra leverage, and because you're gonna start cutting up your hands with this, it's too sharp. Before you remove the bolt that's underneath here, loosen it up a decent amount, and then you're gonna wanna install this other piece. This is gonna help you remove the actual clutch part. What you're gonna wanna do now is get something to hold onto this piece right here, and then to tighten this bolt, it's actually lefty-tighty instead of the standard. So you're gonna wanna tighten this while this holds onto this and pulls it out. You don't want this part to be all the way in as well. I put it all the way in and then loosen it slightly so it has all the threads, but if it's all the way on, it's a lot harder to pull off. Once you've managed to tighten the bolt, this piece right over here will actually come off and it'll start to move. Now you have to remove this whole assembly. Now we're going to pull out this bolt. Keep in mind, this is exactly the distance I had it at. Now we just pulled all that stuff off, and this is what we're left with. While we're still on this side of the bike, let's just pull off the alternator cap and the alternator. Now that I removed all the 8mm, there's 3 total, I can just pull this cover off. Now that the cover's off, it's easier to access these 3 bolts. So I just loosened up all 3 of these. They're all 12mm. Now you just pull out the alternator, and I'm going to put it in the battery box for now. Now let's start working on removing the chain. First, I'm going to loosen up this 10mm right here. And then this one back here is a 32. I especially got this one just for this bike. You're also going to want to use this 32 when working on the clutch. What you're going to want to do to loosen up this right here is essentially not do what I did. You're going to want to have the bike more assembled and put it in gear. Otherwise, you're going to start turning the tire itself. And in my case, because I forgot to do this earlier, I'm just hooking this bar up right in there so the wheel itself is hitting it. And I'm making sure it doesn't pinch a line like the brake line on the other side. This is just like a temporary thing so you can actually take it off. But after that, it's going to be real loose and you're going to want to take it off all the way. To pull off the sprocket, you're gonna have to loosen up the wheel itself and push it forward. I'll show you how to do that now. You're gonna wanna loosen up the 12mm right over here and right over here. Then you got a 22mm right over here, and you're gonna wanna loosen it up. If your chain has just a simple clip on it, if you want, you can just remove the chain instead, and you don't have to mess with the rear of the wheel. But in my case, pushing it forward isn't enough to be able to remove the front sprocket, so I'm gonna have to remove the wheel completely. When you do that, make sure you put everything in an order that you know how it goes back together. Now I've got the sprocket removed and the chain's just hanging there, so I'm gonna worry about that later, and we're gonna move to the other side of the bike. Now we're gonna start pulling out the clutch. First, you're just gonna wanna remove all of these bolts around the side and then just pull it straight out. Now that you have this exposed, you should still have the springs around here, and a 10mm bolt looks just like this. Just pull out all the 10mm. Now we're just gonna pull out these little parts right here. Nice and easy. Make sure that you have them in the correct order. Now we install this special clutch tool. You're gonna wanna use the original bolts that you originally had the springs attached to. Make sure you don't over tighten it or you're gonna break the clutch housing that it's attached to. You just want it to hold on there reasonably tight. After that, it's a 32mm right behind it, and we're gonna put this in it and just loosen it up with both of them. Now that you've gotten this 32mm off, we can move on and get further in and pull off this washer and another washer that's right behind that one. Now what we're gonna do is grab this piece and pull out the entire center section, and the discs are gonna come out with it as well. Now what we're gonna do is remove this center section so we can actually pull out the rest of the clutch. What you're gonna wanna do to get this to come out like this is literally just grab this and go in and out, in and out, in and out, until this thing just keeps coming out more and more and you can pull it out. Now we can just pull this whole thing out. Now that you've put out the gear that goes right over here and the washer that covers this, your bike should look just like this, except you shouldn't have this right over here. That's kind of like a specialty fix I had to do since essentially the thing just blew off, like part of the crankcase, and this now just blocks the hole so the pin can stay in there. Now we're gonna be working on removing this. Just take off all of these. Now that we've got the cover removed, we're gonna backtrack these wires over here, all the way over here, and then just remove them. Now we're gonna be pulling off this in the center, and we're gonna hold on to this while we're doing it. After we've done that, we can pull this piece off. Now what we do is remove these 3 screws right here, and then this one over here, and then pull out this rubber piece, and then the wires that are behind it, we're also gonna pull those straight out from here. Now that all that's out, if you want, you can leave this here. Personally, I'm going to. Back to the other side of the bike, and we're gonna be removing this. It's the neutral indicator. Make sure you don't lose the spring and pin that's right behind it. We're gonna be removing all of this just by removing 2 14mm. Now we're gonna be removing the engine ground. All you have to do is go over there, and you can see I already have the piece on it. It's a 10mm. Now we're gonna start removing the engine from the frame itself. I've already started it. What you're gonna wanna do is remove the bolts from right over here and right over there on the same side. I've already pulled one of them out. Then you're gonna wanna move on to right in there. There's a 14mm, very long, and a 14mm right here. The other side is also 14mm, and there's a spacer in between the top one up here. As you can see, I've got a jack underneath mine. It's holding up the oil pan, and it's gonna take the entire weight of the engine as I slowly bring it down. Normally I remove the oil pan itself when I'm doing this, but in this case I'm just gonna remove the rest of the engine with the oil pan attached. You should have these out and these out for both sides, and all the weight should be supported from the 2 bolts that are over here, and the nuts should be removed by now. And now you're gonna remove right over here, they're 2 12mm, and the same thing on this side. So this one right over here, you're gonna wanna remove this one as well. Now that the lower frame itself is disconnected, we can move on to trying to pull the engine itself. There's only 2 things holding on to it, and those nuts should already be removed. So we're gonna be pulling both of those out, and then while we're doing that, make sure the engine does not fall over. You do not want it to break right now as you're pulling it out. When you're starting to pull yours out, for me, I'm gonna have to make sure the chain doesn't hit it, so I'm gonna pull the chain off while I'm pulling it down. After you remove your engine, both of these should just come out nice and easy. If you haven't already pulled out the oil filter, it's time to do that now. Now we're going to be removing the oil pan. Everything on there is 8mm, and don't forget this one inside of here. Now that the oil pan's off, should have all these over here. We're going to be removing this thing right here, and to remove it completely, there's another 10mm that's under here, so you have to remove this first. Now that all of that is off, we can just pull this right over here off. It's got a little O-ring on it. And then we're going to be pulling off both of these pipes with what I believe is a 12mm underneath. So a 10mm holding this one on, and keep in mind, before you lay this down, you want to remove these pipes because they actually protrude out a little bit. Now we're going to be pulling this off, just a bunch of 10mm. What we're going to do is remove this from this over here, and then pull this off. A pin right behind it that holds onto this. Now we can pull this pin right here out. Now that that pin is out, and this washer as well, we can just pull this thing straight out. Now I'm going to be removing this mounting bracket so I can actually split the case as well. I ended up having some problems when I was trying to split my crankcase, and I ended up not recording taking it apart. And as you can see, I removed some parts that I didn't record. The parts that I removed aren't necessary to actually split the crankcase, but what you're going to want to do is keep in mind all of these parts right here. You're going to want to make sure you remove every single one of these bolts, except this one over here doesn't really matter. And you also don't have to remove this, but make sure you remove every single one of these before you try splitting it. For me, I was banging on it for a few days trying to split it, and it ended up just being that the gasket was like glue practically. So that was my problem, and that's what you're gonna have to do. It's also very easy to forget just one of these bolts as they're hidden all over the place on here. And make sure you also don't forget both of these nuts. There's two total. There's one that goes right here, and the other one goes right underneath here. When you're working on the crankcase, I strongly recommend you use a parts diagram. I found one at SuzukiPartsHouse.com. All you have to do is plug in your year and model, and you can find a diagram for everything. While there are a few parts that I didn't record myself removing, you don't have to remove the ones that I didn't record in order to split the crankcase. Because of that, I'm not going to bother putting everything back together just to show you how to do it. If you look at a parts diagram, you can figure them all out, and when I make a video concerning how to reassemble everything, I'll definitely record it.